Meantime, I want to bring into this conversation former American Airlines CEO and AMR Group Chairman, Bob Crandall. Good morning to you, Bob.
Good morning.
Well, let me just ask you about the issue that Becky raised with Phil, which is to say, what do you think about the balance sheets of these airlines with the bailouts? Assume the bailouts are in place. Are they going to have to go back to the credit markets? Are they going to, by the way, have to go back to the government?
Well, I think. Look, I think this downgrading of Delta to junk is sort of a heads up on what's likely to happen. The airlines had to get bailed out after 9/11. Now they're coming back to the government and saying, "Look, we are an essential utility. You've got to sustain us," and the government is agreeing, and I think properly so. We've got to have an airline system. On the other hand, I'm not at all sure that either long-term loans or grants, and I'm frankly not sure which are included in this Senate bill. But I'm not sure that either of them is sufficient. The airlines are a utility. It is obvious that these kinds of black swan events are always going to have a tremendous and adverse effect on the airlines. And it may very well be, it seems to me, that there's got to be some continuing relationship between the government and the airline industry, and in exchange for which there's got to be some constraints on what the airline industry has been doing. Look, you guys know there's been a lot of publicity about the fact in the last 5 or 6 years the airline industry has spent more than its free cash flow buying back stock. That doesn't make any sense in a business which can be as adversely affected as the airlines have been affected. So it does seem to me we're going to have. I think the government, the airlines are going to have to go back to the credit markets. They may very well have to go back to the government. I think we may collectively have to think differently about the airline industry, which is, in my view, something of a transportation utility. It may need to be constrained and or regulated more along the lines of a utility rather than treated like any other business. It isn't like any other business.
Bob,
it has a unique role in America.
Bob, do you think that all the discussions we've had about stakeholders and ESG and all the things that a lot of companies are doing, you think this might drive a stake into some of that? I mean, Delta's most recent initiative was $1 billion to get carbon neutral. I'm not sure. I haven't heard any updates on that. But when you're in a crisis like this, a lot of these other things that you can do and you're very profitable and in the good times, then things get kind of hard like this. And you wonder, was that a great move to make, to feel good about, what you're doing, I guess?
Well, Joe, we've got, as you guys know, because you're talking about them all the time, we have a variety of really big issues in the United States. We've got a huge issue in terms of income inequality. We've got a huge issue of how do we deal with climate change. Right at the moment, the issues that we have to deal with are this coronavirus, and we've got to sustain our transportation utilities. So the answer to your question is sure. This carbon neutrality issue right at the moment is kind of off the table and may very well be off the table for the next 4 or 5 years until, we've got to settle for the long term. How are we going to provide a transportation utility for the United States? And I think sometime over the next couple of years, people are going to have to sit down and think very carefully about whether we want to be in a situation where we have to bail the industry out every 5 years.
Bob, to hear an insider like yourself suggest effectively that these airlines be nationalized to some degree, which, by the way, is not so far from something that Dave Calhoun mentioned yesterday, though I know he doesn't want to take equity stakes in Boeing. But in terms of thinking about these much more as utilities, how would you structure that? And by the way, if you're right, Bob, you have to imagine that shareholders would likely get wiped out or to some degree be injured much more than where, I mean, you look at the stock, these companies still have huge valuations.
Well, that's true, and I'm not at all sure that you're going to have to wipe out the existing shareholders or wipe out the existing valuations. On the other hand, and I wouldn't use the term nationalization, but I do think it may be essential to have some kind of an underlying line of credit, quote unquote, with the government. And I think in exchange
but you'd have to
I mean,
I think what Dave Calhoun was saying yesterday was you'd almost have to regulate them like banks. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Okay,
so they'd have to have a cushion.
Okay.
They'd be required to have a certain, right?
Yes, I think there would be requirements. For example, I think you'd simply have to give up the notion of buying back shares. I think you'd have to accept some limitations on executive compensation. I think you'd have to accept some limitations on the extent to which airlines can abandon any particular city that they now serve. I think you'd have to accept some limitations on whether you can send maintenance work abroad, which is essentially exporting jobs. So there are a whole variety of things that if the government's going to have a sort of a continuing underwriting notion, the industry is going to have to live with some constraints. And though that trade-off may be in the best long-term interest of the country.